In 40,000 years of warfare, one name echoes above all others. Not a Primarch, not a demon, not some warp-touched abomination. A mortal man, if you can call what Sigismund became mortal, who made demigods hesitate. This is the story of the first captain of the Imperial Fists, the Emperor's champion, the sword that never broke, the man who spent 10,000 years killing the galaxy's greatest warriors, and never once lost a duel, until the very end. Here is the thing that should be impossible. In a universe where godlike Primarchs reshape planets with their bare hands, where reality-warping psykers can boil your blood with a thought, where demon princes command legions that have fought since before humanity crawled out of the mud, the greatest swordsman to ever live was technically just a space marine. No special mutations, no sorcerous gifts, no demon blade whispering secrets into his skull, just gene-enhanced reflexes, an unbreakable will, and a weapon called the Black Sword. Picture him now, battle-scarred Astartes in weathered black armor bearing the Imperial Aquila, standing beneath harsh light that catches every dent, every gouge, every mark left by 10 millennia of endless war. His presence radiates something that goes beyond mere threat. This is controlled violence given form. A hurricane compressed into the shape of a man, waiting for permission to destroy everything in its path. Other champions actively avoided him. Chaos lords who had fought for millennia, who had bargained their souls for power beyond mortal comprehension, would retreat rather than face him. Demon princes would pause their eternal scheming to wonder if that black-armored figure in the distance might be him. The mere rumor of his presence could end battles before they began. So what made Sigismund different? The Imperium has produced millions of space marines across its bloody history, thousands of chapter masters, hundreds of legendary heroes whose names still echo through the corridors of fortress monasteries. But only one earned the title of greatest swordsman in 40,000 years of galactic warfare. The answer lies not just in his skill, though that skill bordered on the supernatural. It lies in his absolute, terrifying conviction. Sigismund did not fight because he was ordered to. He did not fight for glory or honor or even survival. He fought because he believed, with every fiber of his being, that the Emperor was a god, that humanity was chosen, that every enemy he killed was a prayer made manifest in blood and broken bodies. This is a tragedy, not because Sigismund fails, he never truly fails, but because his greatest strength becomes the wound that never heals. His unshakable faith will cost him everything: his legion, his father's love, and ultimately, his life. But even in death, he will achieve something no other warrior in the Imperium's history ever has. 10,000 years after the heresy, an ancient warrior in black armor will face Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, heir to Horus, the man who united the fractured traitor legions through sheer hatred and bottomless ambition. In that final duel, Sigismund will prove that faith, properly wielded, is sharper than any blade. The wound he carves into Abaddon's face will never heal. A permanent reminder, carried for another 10,000 years, that the Emperor's champion could not be broken, only killed. And even that took a demon blade screaming for his soul. This is the story of how a single space marine became the most feared warrior in a galaxy of gods and monsters. How belief became weapon, how conviction became armor, and how one man's refusal to compromise, to doubt, to bend, created a legend that would outlast empires. The Emperor had a champion. His name was Sigismund, and this is how he became immortal. The galaxy Sigismund was born into no longer exists. Terra, during the apocalyptic final days of the Unification Wars wasn't a planet. It was a charnel house. Millennia of techno-barbarian rule had fractured humanity's birthplace into a patchwork of competing hells. Warlords in kilometers-high fortresses fought with weapons that could crack continents, unleashing viral phages and forgotten physics that twisted the laws of reality. Rad storms, green and hungry, scoured the blasted earth, turning entire populations into gibbering mutants. Human life held no value beyond its utility as cannon fodder. This was the world that birthed the greatest swordsman in history. He was a Terran-born aspirant of the 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists. Unlike later generations of Space Marines, recruited from feral death worlds or proud feudal societies, Sigismund came from old Terra's killing fields. He learned violence before he learned to speak. Death wasn't a concept to be contemplated. It was the air he breathed, the dust that coated his tongue. This is critical to understanding him. The process of becoming an Astartes didn't strip away his illusions. He never possessed any. From his first conscious memory, he understood that existence was warfare. The Emperor's Great Crusade wasn't a new, terrible reality for him. It was simply a better organized version of the one he'd always known. The Imperial Fists, under their Primarch, Rogel Dorn, were already legends. The 7th Legion, the Praetorians of Terra. Stoic, indomitable, masters of siegecraft and defense. They were the Emperor's unbreakable wall. But from the moment the gene seed took hold, it was clear that young Sigismund was something else. Where his brothers excelled at enduring, at holding ground, at building fortifications that could withstand eternity, Sigismund excelled at killing. Not adequate killing. Not efficient, by-the-book killing. Perfect killing. His instructors noted it with a growing sense of unease. The boy didn't just learn combat doctrine. He seemed to absorb it through his skin. A new blade form wasn't a sequence to be memorized, but a language he already spoke. Opponents in the training cages were not peers to be bested. They were complex problems with glaringly obvious solutions. A feint was a grammatical error in a sentence he'd already read. A lunge was a predictable rhyme. He moved through the brutal training regimens of the Fists, not with the grit of an aspirant being forged, but with the terrifying calm of a weapon being polished. His rise through the ranks was meteoric, a trajectory that troubled even his superiors. Sergeant, veteran, captain. By the time the Great Crusade was in full swing, he had already earned the title of First Captain, the highest rank an Astartes could hold beneath the Primarch himself. Other legions took notice. The demigods who led them took notice. Whispers spread through the fleets of the Legiones Astartes. The stoic, defensive Imperial Fists had produced something special, a predator in a legion of sentinels. His relationship with Rogel Dorn was proud, but deeply complicated. Dorn, the ultimate pragmatist, recognized his son's unparalleled gift. He saw a perfect weapon, and he used it. Yet, he remained wary of its nature. The Imperial Fists valued discipline, duty, and sacrifice above all. Sigismund possessed these qualities in abundance, but beneath them burned a fire that Dorn couldn't quite name, an intensity that didn't match the Legion's stoic, golden-armored character. It was a hunger that went far beyond mere duty. And therein lay the schism that would define Sigismund's entire existence. He was surrounded by brothers who fought because they must, because it was their function. They were the shield. But Sigismund fought because he wanted to. He craved it, and that burning, consuming need to test himself, to find a worthy opponent, to offer prayer through perfect violence. That was the very thing that would eventually separate him from his legion, his father, and everything he was supposed to protect. The Great Crusade was humanity's golden age, a breathtaking expansion across the stars, under the banner of the Emperor. It was an era of demigods. 20 Primarchs, each a myth made manifest, led their legions in a symphony of conquest and reunification. And somehow, impossibly, a single Astartes began to carve out a legend so sharp it made even these transhuman generals take notice. His name was Sigismund. His reputation was not built on speeches or strategies. It was forged in blood and steel, one duel at a time. During the bitter compliance of Sharat, he faced the orc war boss, Grokthorn the Unbreakable, a green-skinned monster encased in scavenged armor that had personally killed 3 loyalist chapter masters. The war boss charged, a roaring avalanche of metal and muscle. Sigismund met him. 17 seconds later, the war boss lay in pieces on the blood-soaked ground, dismantled with a surgical brutality that left both armies momentarily stunned. In the lair system, home to a Xenos species whose entire culture revolved around blade combat, he didn't just defeat their champion. He challenged him using their own ritual forms and slew him so perfectly that the lair's morale shattered completely. When a hedonistic Dark Eldar Archon dared to raid an Imperial convoy, Sigismund pursued him not just to his ship, but into the maddening labyrinth of the webway itself. He returned days later, alone, carrying the Xenos Lord's head. Rogel Dorn formalized what the galaxy was already learning. Sigismund became the first official champion of the 7th Legion, a role that went far beyond ceremony. He was Dorn's executioner. When a rebel king needed to be made an example of, Sigismund was sent. When a Xenos warlord's challenge could not be ignored, Sigismund answered. He became the living embodiment of the Imperial Fist's martial pride, the single point of failure for any enemy who believed the Legion could be broken. Other legions, filled with their own legendary warriors, watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The proud Luna Wolves, Horus's own sons, respected him as a peer, despite his Astartes rank. The World Eaters, Angron's blood-mad berserkers, who lived only for the carnage of the fighting pits, actively refused to face him in the training cages. Their greatest gladiator, a rising star named Karn, reportedly tested himself against Sigismund on multiple occasions. He lost. Every single time. The duelists of the Emperor's children, a legion obsessed with achieving perfection in all things, would acquire recordings of his battles and study them like sacred texts, trying to deconstruct the flawless, lethal geometry of his movements. Within the Imperial Fists, this was codified in the Feast of Blades, a ritual tournament where the Legion's greatest swordsmen would compete for honor. For a time, it was a celebrated tradition. Then Sigismund began competing. He won. Always. He won so consistently, so utterly, that eventually his own brothers simply stopped challenging him. The contest became a formality, his victory an assumed fact. But a shadow grew beneath this mountain of glory. Sigismund's prowess was beginning to exceed what his gene seed alone should allow. His reflexes were faster than transhuman, his ability to anticipate an opponent's every move, bordering on true precognition. He didn't just react to an enemy's lunge, he was already moving to counter it before their muscles had even fully tensed. Questions began to circulate in quiet whispers through the Legion's halls. How was he this good? Was it merely talent and a lifetime of relentless training? Or was there something else at work? The truth was a secret Sigismund kept locked behind his iron will. He possessed a touch of the psyker's gift. It wasn't enough to hurl lightning or read minds, but it was enough. Enough to grant him a whisper of foresight in the heat of combat. And in a legion that prided itself on purity, that distrusted the warp and its witch sorcery with a cold, absolute certainty, that secret was a bomb waiting to detonate. The betrayal at Istvan III was not a message, It was a shockwave that cracked the foundation of reality. When the news finally reached the Imperial fists, transmitted in broken, screaming fragments across the void, it was met with a silence more profound than any battle roar. Horus Lupercal, War Master, the Emperor's most beloved son, was a traitor. Half the Legions Astartes had turned. The Great Crusade was a lie, its golden promise curdling into a galaxy-spanning civil war. On the bridge of the Phalanx, stoic veterans of 1,000 campaigns stared at their data slates in stunned disbelief. Some fell to their knees, the psychological impact as devastating as any physical blow. They felt grief, denial, a hollow sense of world-ending confusion. But Sigismund felt something else entirely. As the panicked chatter filled the command deck, as officers demanded confirmation and strategos struggled to comprehend the scale of the treachery, the first captain felt a profound and terrifying sense of clarity. The universe, for the first time, finally made perfect sense. This was what he was for. This was what he had been forged to do. Not the tedious work of compliance, not the politics of empire building. War. True war. A holy war against the ultimate enemy. The long, slow peace was over. The hunt had begun. This newfound purpose was immediately put to the test. He received his orders directly from Rogel Dorn. He was to join Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard aboard the frigate Eisenstein, to carry the warning of Horus's treachery directly back to Terra. It was a mission of absolute importance, but before he could depart, he was intercepted. A woman, a former remembrancer named Euphrates Keeler, now radiating a faint, unnerving luminescence, stood in his path. His guards moved to shove her aside, but Sigismund held up a hand. He saw the conviction in her eyes, a fire that mirrored his own. She spoke, but the voice was not entirely hers. It was deeper, resonant with an authority that had no right to exist in a mortal throat. She delivered a vision, a prophecy. She told him not to go. She told him that if he boarded the Eisenstein, he would die with his brothers at the drop site massacre on Istvan V. And if he died, Terra would fall. He had a choice. His duty, his orders, the direct command of his Primarch, the father he revered above all else, or the words of a mad prophetess, a mystic vision that promised salvation at the cost of his honor. For the first and only time in his life, Sigismund placed faith above duty. He disobeyed. The consequences were not long in coming. When Rogel Dorn discovered the deception, and worse, when he learned it was based on a prophecy, on the words of a religious visionary, his fury was absolute. The Imperial fists did not believe in gods. They did not heed prophets. They were built on the rock of the imperial truth, logic, reason, and the unshakable chain of command. And Sigismund, his first captain, his greatest warrior, had betrayed it all for a ghost story. The confrontation took place in Dorn's private scriptorium, a cold, silent chamber where the only sound was the hum of the starship's heart. Dorn didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Sigismund, and the first captain felt the weight of that gaze more than any physical blow. It was an expression of profound, soul-crushing disappointment. And then he spoke the words that would carve a wound in Sigismund deeper than any blade. You have allowed superstition to poison your mind. You have abandoned your duty for a feeling. You are not my son. But here is the universe's cruelest joke, the tragic irony that would define Sigismund's entire existence. He was right. The prophecy was true. Had he boarded the Eisenstein, he would have been slaughtered at Istvan V. Without Sigismund's blade at the siege of Terra, the walls would have broken. His act of faith saved humanity. His act of faith cost him his father's love. Both statements are true. and neither one cancels the other. The Siege of Terra was not a battle. It was the apocalypse made manifest. It was the single bloodiest, most cataclysmic conflict in all of recorded human history. 9 traitor legions, bolstered by uncountable demon hosts and led by the corrupted War Master Horus himself, descended upon humanity's throne world. The sky didn't just burn, it was torn open. Bleeding raw warp energy that turned clouds to screaming faces and rain to liquid despair. The ground cracked under the weight of demon engines the size of city blocks. Reality itself began to fray at the edges as the chaos gods poured their infinite malice into breaching the walls of the imperial palace. And at those walls, his black armor, a sliver of defiant midnight against the hellish glow, stood Sigismund. While his brothers, the stoic sons of Dorn, held the ramparts and died by the thousands to plug every breach, Sigismund took on a different role. He was not a defender. He was a hunter. He became the Emperor's avenging sword, leading hand-picked kill teams on surgical strikes deep into the heart of the enemy lines. He did not wait for the challenge to come to him. He sought it out, a predator stalking through the largest battlefield the galaxy had ever known. He moved through the carnage not as a soldier, but as a reckoning. The champions of chaos, drunk on newfound power and eager to claim glory, found themselves facing a force of nature. A World Eater's champion, who had personally accounted for the deaths of 100 loyalist Marines at the Lion's Gate spaceport, met Sigismund and was dismantled in 3 precise, contemptuous strikes. A Death Guard warlord, commanding a plague company whose very presence rotted ceramite, found his Nurgle-gifted resilience meant nothing as Sigismund's blade punched through his chest and severed his primary heart. When the sons of Horus, in their arrogance, deployed their own celebrated champion, a warrior chosen and armed specifically to kill the Emperor's greatest swordsman, Sigismund met him at the base of the Saturnine Wall. The fight was over so quickly that the few surviving witnesses could never agree on exactly what had happened, only that the traitor's head was no longer attached to his body. Word began to spread through the traitor legions, a whispered fear that cut through even their warp-fueled madness. The black-armored death was hunting. Chaos Space Marines who had embraced damnation, who laughed at mortality and feared nothing in the material universe, began to hesitate. Commanders started routing their forces around sectors where Sigismund was rumored to be fighting. Not because they couldn't fight, but because fighting him was a mathematical certainty of death. The legend was cemented during the battle for the Gorgon Bar, amid the burning ruins of the palace walls. There, he met Karn, the future chosen of Khorne, the most feared and respected close combat warrior among all the traitor legions, wielder of the roaring chain-axe Gorechild. The duel was not a quick execution. It was a grinding, brutal epic that lasted for hours. The 2 greatest Astartes swordsmen of their generation tore a circle of absolute destruction around themselves. Blades met with impacts that shattered stone and sent plumes of superheated dust into the air. Both warriors pushed beyond pain, beyond exhaustion, beyond any limit a transhuman body was meant to endure. And when it was over, Karn the betrayer lay broken and unconscious in the rubble, a heap of mangled armor and shattered pride. Sigismund, bleeding from a dozen grievous wounds, simply walked away. But even a demigod of the blade can bleed. Even faith has limits that the flesh cannot exceed. By the siege's final days, Sigismund was a walking ghost held together by sheer will. His armor was more patch job and prayer than solid plate. His body was failing, riddled with wounds that would have killed a normal Astartes a dozen times over. But he kept fighting. He kept hunting. Then, it was over. Horus was dead. The Emperor was broken and entombed upon the golden throne. The grand dream of the Great Crusade had burned to ash. As the last of the traitor fleets fled into the void, Sigismund stood on the corpse-strewn walls of the palace he had bled to defend. There was no triumph, no relief. Looking out at the ruined galaxy, he understood a terrible truth. The war hadn't ended. It had only just begun. In the smoldering aftermath of the heresy, the Imperium was a body with its heart torn out. The Emperor sat entombed upon the golden throne, a psychic lighthouse powered by a dying god, neither truly alive nor truly dead. The surviving loyalist Primarchs scattered, some dead, some missing, some retreating into bitter isolation. And the great legions that had conquered the galaxy, the very tools that had built the Imperium, were now seen as its greatest threat. An order came down from Robot Guilliman, author of the new Codex Astartes. The legions must be broken, divided into smaller 1,000-man chapters to ensure no single warrior could ever again command the loyalty of 100,000 Marines and point them at Terra. Rogel Dorn resisted. His imperial fists were the Emperor's Praetorians, the unbreakable shield. To shatter them felt like sacrilege. For 7 long years, the 7th Legion refused to comply, a stand of stubborn pride that ended in disaster. At the infamous Iron Cage, a devastating trap laid by the hated Iron Warriors, the imperial fists were bled white, nearly annihilated by their treacherous cousins. The defeat broke Dorn's legendary stoicism. He accepted the new order. The Sons of Dorn would become many. And this is where the final, tragic break between father and son occurred. When it came time to appoint the leaders of these new successor chapters, Dorn's decision for Sigismund was swift and cold. He would be made the first High Marshal of a new, fleet-based chapter, the Black Templars. This was not an honor. It was exile. Dorn still could not forgive his first captain for the prophecy, for the disobedience, for the sin of choosing faith over duty. By making Sigismund the leader of his own chapter, Dorn ensured his most zealous, most troublesome son would never again serve at his side. The Black Templars weren't just a successor, they were a severance, Dorn's way of sending the living embodiment of his disappointment as far away as possible. But Sigismund took this exile and transformed it into a holy mandate. If his father and his legion rejected his faith, then fine. He would build a brotherhood founded entirely upon it. He would forge a chapter that was everything the imperial fists were not. Where the fists valued stoicism and defense, the Black Templars would value righteous fury and holy offense. Where other chapters built fortress monasteries to guard their territory, the Black Templars would take to the stars in an eternal crusade, never stopping, never resting. Their only home the deck of a warship pointed at the enemy. They would be a legion of zealots. Sigismund's new chapter immediately cast aside the Codex Astartes' strictures on chapter size, quietly maintaining a fighting force of 5,000 to 6,000 warriors. A legion in all but name. Who was going to tell them to stop? Their hatred of the psyker, the witch, and the mutant became legendary. A bitter irony given that Sigismund's own preternatural skill stemmed from a latent psychic gift he refused to acknowledge. And most importantly, he codified his own experience. He established the tradition of the Emperor's champion, warriors who, on the eve of battle, would be granted a divine vision, taking up the black sword to fight as the Emperor's personal instrument. It was Sigismund institutionalizing the very thing that had saved him, creating a legacy where others could receive the same guidance that had cost him his father's love. The Black Templars became Sigismund's answer to Dorn. Every crusade was an act of devotion. Every heretic world burned clean of corruption was proof that the Emperor heard his prayers. Every enemy champion slain was a sermon delivered with a blade. But deep beneath the fury and the zeal, the wound remained. He had been disowned, cast out for the crime of believing too strongly. And so, the words echoed through the millennia, a ghost in the machine of his faith. "You are not my son." Sigismund would spend the next 10,000 years screaming his faith at the galaxy, trying to prove his worth to a father who was no longer there to see it. Most Space Marines measure their service in centuries. Sigismund measured his in millennia. As the first and eternal High Marshal of the Black Templars, he led crusade after crusade, a storm of black and white steel tearing across the galaxy. His name, once a whispered legend among the legions, became a mythological force. Man became myth, and myth became a weapon. The chronicles of his endless war read like a holy text written in blood. During the Gerulus Crusade, he faced the demon prince Kujul Khan, a creature of the warp that had feasted on the souls of a dozen worlds. On the shattered plains of a dead planet, Sigismund met the demon in single combat, and, with a prayer on his lips, drove the black sword through its ephemeral heart, banishing the creature with a shriek that echoed in the immaterium for 1,000 years. During the Vinculus Crusade, he led his Templars against an orc Wa, so massive it blotted out the stars of an entire sector. Ignoring the grand strategy of fleet engagements, Sigismund challenged the hulking war boss in full view of both armies. The greenskin fell, and the Wa broke against the rock of Sigismund's conviction. When the Thondros campaign pitted him against a Chaos Lord who had accumulated 8,000 years of martial experience since the heresy, the ancient traitor discovered a terrible truth. 8 millennia of practice meant nothing against 10 millennia of purpose. His reputation evolved beyond mere skill. It became a strategic reality. Enemy commanders began planning their entire wars around him, not how to defeat him, but how to avoid him entirely. In the Eye of Terror, Chaos warlords would study star charts, and upon seeing the telltale black cross of a Templar fleet, would redirect entire invasions rather than risk facing the eternal Crusader. The mere rumor of his presence in a war zone was sometimes enough to make traitor Astartes break and flee, a ghost from their grandsire's age, come to collect a blood debt. But even a demigod of war is not immune to time's erosion. Sigismund didn't age in the conventional sense. Astartes' biology and an iron will kept his body a finely honed weapon. The true toll was psychic, a weight on the soul that transcended the physical. 10,000 years of combat is an eternity of loss. He watched his original brothers, the veterans of the siege, die one by one. He watched entire successor chapters rise in glory and fall to ruin. Most damningly, he watched the Imperium he had fought to save decay into a grotesque parody of itself. The secular, enlightened empire the Emperor had dreamed of was gone, replaced by a nightmare of superstition, ignorance, and unimaginable cruelty. In the quiet hours aboard his flagship, surrounded by the silent relics of his long war, the doubts would creep in. He had embraced faith in the Emperor as a god, but that faith had metastasized into the imperial creed, a monstrous institution used by the ecclesiarchy to oppress and control trillions. Had he actually saved anything? Or had he merely prolonged the galaxy's suffering? Had he won the war? Or had he simply helped create a different, slower kind of defeat? But what kept him fighting, what kept the fire burning in his soul, was a terrible, simple certainty. To stop was to betray everything. As long as a single heretic drew breath, as long as one Xenos ship fouled Imperial space, as long as the archenemy plotted in the warp, the crusade must continue. It was his purpose. His faith didn't require answers from a silent god. It required only conviction. The sword stayed sharp, because a dull blade served no one, and so he fought on, not for a dying empire he no longer recognized, but for the memory of the man he still called Master. Knowing his own time was finite, he poured his knowledge into others, training successive generations of Emperor's champions, passing his techniques to warriors who would carry his legacy forward. The chapter champion tradition became his promise. Even when he fell, his blade would not. For 7 centuries, the Imperium bled and healed and forgot. The heresy was history, a half-remembered nightmare told to frightened children. But chaos never truly dies. It waits. And then, from the raw, weeping wound in reality known as the Eye of Terror, a fleet emerged, a tide of black steel and burning hatred, led by a single, terrifying will. Abaddon the Despoiler, former first captain of the Sons of Horus, had returned. This wasn't just another chaos warlord clawing his way into real space for slaves and plunder. This was the true heir to Horus's legacy of betrayal. This was the warrior who had stood at the War Master's right hand, the one who, in the heresy's immediate aftermath, had personally cut the arms from Horus's corpse to retrieve the talon of Horus and Worldbreaker, rather than let his father's war gear become trophies for the ruinous powers. He had spent 700 years in hell, not screaming, but scheming. He had beaten the fractured, insane traitor legions into a unified force through sheer, bottomless hatred and a will that even demon princes learned to fear. The first Black Crusade had begun. When the astropathic choirs screamed the news across the void, the message found Sigismund aboard the Eternal Crusader. For the ancient High Marshal, there was no shock, no fear. There was only a cold, silent, and profound sense of arrival. He had spent millennia hunting the phantoms of the heresy, slaying its lesser children and demon-worshipping pretenders. Now, the monster itself had come home. This was the enemy he had been waiting for, not some Xenos beast or nameless demon prince. The man who wore Horus's failure as a mantle. If Sigismund could kill Abaddon, he could finally kill the heresy itself. He could prove, in blood and steel, that faith was stronger than corruption, that the Emperor's will could unmake anything the dark gods ever created. The Black Templars responded not as a fleet, but as a spear. The First Black Crusade was a campaign of pure terror. Abaddon struck at targets chosen for their symbolic value, not their strategic importance. He burned shrine worlds. He toppled monuments to loyalist Primarchs. He slaughtered the defenders of fortresses that had held for 1,000 years. And Sigismund pursued. His fleet hunted Abaddons across a dozen sectors, each engagement bringing him closer, each battle adding new names to the Black Templars' endless roll of the honored dead. They would arrive at worlds already cooling to ash, the 8-pointed star of chaos branded onto the planetary crust like a personal taunt. Sigismund understood what his subordinates, for all their zeal, did not. This wasn't a military campaign. It was a spiritual reckoning. The Horus Heresy had never truly ended. It had simply paused. Horus was dead, but his ambition, his rage, his ultimate betrayal, it all lived on in Abaddon. The Emperor sat entombed on his golden throne, but his conviction, his blade, his unyielding purpose, it lived in Sigismund. 2 faiths, 2 visions for the galaxy's future, were converging on a final point of impact. The hunt wore on. Sigismund was old, not just centuries old, but millennia. His body, a tapestry of ancient scars and augmetic repairs, had survived wounds that should have killed him 1,000 times over. His mind remained a razor, but he could feel the immense, crushing weight of time. He knew, with the same chilling, preternatural certainty that had once guided him away from Istvan, that this would be his final battle. He did not feel this as a premonition of defeat. he felt it as a price. He was a weapon forged for one purpose, and that purpose was now before him. Even victory demands payment. Finally, in the void around the Uralan system, the fleets engaged. A storm of macro cannon fire and lance strikes turned space into a charnel house. Ships died in blossoming fireballs that lit the system like angry new stars. Reality buckled as the energies of the warp bled through the despoiler's fleet, and amid the apocalyptic carnage, on the bridges of two great flagships, two champions prepared to meet. The past and the present were about to collide, and only one would walk away. The confrontation that followed would become a foundational myth of the Imperium, a duel whispered in training cages and screamed as a battle cry for the next 10,000 years. The setting was a stage fit for legends, the buckled, groaning observation deck of Abaddon's battle barge, the vengeful spirit. Emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows, and through a fractured viewport, the fires of the Uralan fleet burned like a sea of dying stars. There stood Sigismund, ancient beyond measure, his black armor a chronicle of violence, each scar a victory won in the Emperor's name. In his hands, the black sword was still, a sliver of perfect, patient night. Opposite him, Abaddon the Despoiler was a monument to hatred. He was a giant in his Terminator plate, the air around him thick with malice, and in his grasp, the demon sword Drachnyan thrashed with a life of its own. It was not silent. It screamed, a high, thin sound that scraped at the inside of the skull, a constant keen of 1 billion murdered souls. The duel began without a word. Their blades met with a sound that wasn't metal on metal, but something far worse. The collision of pure faith and absolute malevolence. The impact sent a spiderweb of cracks across the deck plating. Abaddon fought with the unrestrained fury of a storm, his every swing powered by the raw might of chaos and the strength of his transhuman frame. He was a force of nature, a demigod of destruction. And Sigismund was dismantling him. For all his demonic power, for all his rage, Abaddon was being outfought. The ancient Templar's skill was a thing of impossible perfection. He moved not with the fury of his youth, but with the sublime economy of 10 millennia of practice. His defense was a fortress. His attacks were surgical. He wasn't predicting Abaddon's moves. He was reading the despoiler's intent, his very soul, and countering it before the thought had fully formed. The black sword was a blur, parrying, deflecting, and scoring shallow cuts on the despoiler's armor, each one a calculated insult. Abaddon was being given a lesson, and his fury grew with every failed blow. This was the turning point. Abaddon wasn't just a warrior, he was a vessel, and the thing he carried was far older and far more hateful than he was. Sensing its host's failure, Drachnyan acted. The demon sword was not merely a weapon, it was a sentient cancer, the first murder-given form, and it wanted Sigismund's soul. Abaddon swung, but the blade moved with its own supernatural volition, twisting in a way that defied physics and reason. It bypassed Sigismund's flawless guard, not through superior technique, but through a reality-warping lunge of pure spite. The mortal wound was dealt. Drachnyan's tip, screaming in triumph, punched through the ceramide of Sigismund's chest plate. Corrupt, warp-forged energy erupted through his body, burning through his twin hearts, his ancient organs, his very spirit. 10,000 years of service, of crusading, of prayer through violence. It all came down to this. He was dying, but he was not dead yet. Impaled on the demon blade, held upright by the very weapon that was killing him, Sigismund performed his final act. He ignored the soul-tearing agony. He ignored the triumphant shriek of the demon. With a will forged in the fires of the heresy and tempered over millennia of war, he raised the black sword one last time. The movement was slow, deliberate, powered not by muscle, but by an unbreakable oath. His blade carved a single deep gash across Abaddon's face, scoring a permanent line through the eye of Horus tattoo, forever marring the despoiler's visage. Abaddon roared in pain and shock, staggering back, pulling his demon sword free. Sigismund remained standing, a fountain of blood pouring from his chest. He looked at the heir of Horus, his eyes still burning with the cold light of faith, and spoke his last words. They were not a plea or a curse, but a prophecy. You will die as your weakling father died, soulless, honorless, weeping, eternally damned. And then Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, first High Marshal of the Black Templars, the Emperor's champion, died on his feet. The greatest swordsman in the history of mankind fell, not because his skill had failed, but because even the strongest mortal body is a finite vessel against an infinite evil. He was killed, but he was never, ever broken. Sigismund's body was recovered by his sons. In the chaotic aftermath of the duel, as Abaddon's fleet reeled from its decapitation strike, a squad of sword brethren fought their way onto the vengeful spirit. They found their High Marshal where he fell, his black armor a stark monument amidst the debris. They knelt, not in grief, but in silent, terrible reverence. His body was carried from that cursed deck and interred in a stasis crypt aboard the Eternal Crusader, the flagship of the chapter he had forged. His weapons, his armor, his very gene seed became the holiest of relics. For the next 10,000 years, neophytes and champions alike would make the pilgrimage to his shrine, to touch the scarred plate of the warrior who taught them that faith was a weapon, and to whisper his name in prayer. Abaddon retreated. The First Black Crusade, which had torn a bloody swathe across the segmentum obscurus, guttered out and failed. The despoiler pulled his forces back into the Eye of Terror, not as a conqueror, but as a wounded warlord. The gash Sigismund had carved into his face never healed. No dark gift from the chaos gods, no warp sorcery, no fleshcraft could erase it. It remained a livid, puckered line, a permanent reminder, etched into his very being, that the Emperor's greatest champion had marked him for eternity. Every time he saw his reflection, he would be reminded of the ancient warrior who died on his feet, refusing to break. The Black Templars did not mourn. They did not weep. They took their grief and their rage, and they weaponized it. Sigismund's death was not an ending. It was a catalyst. His eternal crusade became their eternal crusade. His name became their battle cry. His teachings were codified into the rites of every duel. His final prophecy against Abaddon, repeated as a sacred vow before every battle. They did not seek to replace him. They sought to become him, a legion of Sigismunds unleashed upon a galaxy that had dared to take their father from them. His legend seeped into the very bedrock of the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy, ever eager to claim a martyr, canonized him as a saint of the imperial creed. The Inquisition cited his story as irrefutable proof that purity of spirit could overcome any demonic corruption. Other Space Marine chapters, even those who looked down on the Templars' fanatical zeal, spoke his name with a respect reserved for Primarchs. He became the benchmark, the impossible standard against which all other swordsmen were measured and found wanting. This returns us to the question: what made him different? It was not merely his skill, though it bordered on the supernatural. It was not merely his faith, though it was absolute. It was the fusion of the two into something the galaxy had never seen before. For Sigismund, combat was a form of prayer. Every duel was a sermon delivered with a blade. He believed, with a conviction that burned hotter than a star, that the Emperor watched him, that every enemy slain was an offering, that 10,000 years of unrelenting war had a divine purpose. And the most beautiful, terrible truth of the 41st millennium is that he was probably right. The Emperor on the Golden Throne is sustained by the psychic energies of faith, Sigismund's faith, focused to a razor's edge and refined over 10 millennia of constant holy violence, may have been the purest, most potent offering ever made. Every traitor he cut down, every demon he banished, fed the dying light of the Astronomicon, keeping humanity's beacon lit for just one more day. We will never know if Rogel Dorn forgave him. The Primarch vanished into the darkness of the galaxy, with that wound between them still open. The words, "You are not my son," left hanging in the void of history. But perhaps that is the final lesson of Sigismund's life. True conviction does not require approval. True faith serves even when it is not loved in return. 10,000 years after his death, the eternal crusade continues. The Black Templars still scour the stars. His successors, the Emperor's champions, still take up the black sword to face the darkness. And Abaddon, the despoiler, still leads his black crusades, his face forever marred by the final defiance of a dying man. Sigismund did more than just win battles. He proved that in a universe of endless horror, one thing remains sharper than any claw and stronger than any demon. Faith, properly wielded, is the greatest weapon of all.